White power.
This is Grant Bristow. He's standing in front of Dachau concentration camp. He is a self-avowed anti-racist, so if I told you he was there with Canada's top neo-Nazis, would that shock you? The group would begin loudly and passionately denying the Holocaust and were eventually harassed out of the camp. How Grant ended up in this situation is a long and complicated tale that is affecting life even today. Some think this social chameleon somehow engineered the rise of the alt-right white power movement in the 1990s,
under the guise of outing members to destroy neo-Nazism in Canada.
Instead of destroying it, he paradoxically fostered it,
using taxpayer dollars to bankroll the scheme.
There are some others that think that his work was effective in putting names of dangerous offenders in the hands of people who could put them away. Let's dive into the Bristow affair.
Grant was born in Winnipeg on February 16, 1958.
His father worked for the Canadian Department of National Defence, and his mother was a banker. He enjoyed a comfortable life until 11 years later when his parents would divorce. His mother gained custody and remarried, moving Grant and his brother to Halifax and eventually to Toronto, where they would build their new family. He excelled at school and found he could make new friends easily, a trait that would come in handy later in life. Grant says that his mother was keen on civil rights and imbued him with a sense of right and wrong when it came to racial inequality. A friend whose family was nearly wiped out during the Holocaust would expand his views on anti-Semitism. His social chameleon act was so successful he would join various private investigation firms after graduating from community college in Toronto with a business degree. At the same time, he took a job at a strip club called Le Strip at 237 Yonge Street. The club was owned by comedian Don Cullen, who was unimpressed by Bristow after watching him attempt comedy during an open mic night. Testing his skills at social manipulation, Grant claimed that he was the assistant manager of the club when talking to patrons, while in truth, he was the DJ. Don remembers him as a conspiracy nut who really wanted to become a police officer. Grant would be fired after being caught drinking on the job. Thankfully for him, the private investigation business picked up and he was able to stay afloat. In 1986, he accepted a position as a security investigator at the shipping giant Kuehne & Nagel, while still moonlighting in the PI business. The same year, he was contracted by a South African diplomat to spy on anti-apartheid protesters in Canada, under the premise that he would be providing them security. After talking to a friend about it, he was told to contact CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. CSIS is a whole video into itself, so I'll keep it brief. It's the child of the RCMP Security Service, initially called the RCMP Intelligence Section. The department would spy on suspected communists, unionists, and Marxists across Canada. In 1962, now the Directorate of Security Intelligence, it would spy on various separatist groups like the FLQ. A new decade and a new name, the 70s brought the new RCMP Security Service and a new scandal when they were caught cataloging separatist Parti Québécois members, all under the guise of a money laundering investigation. Prior to the formation of CSIS, the RCMP-SS was accused of a string of B&Es and firebombings. More would come out when one of the homemade bombs went off in an officer's hand. The jig was up. The RCMP went back to being federal cops, and CSIS was now the head of intelligence after being created in 1984. One of the first tasks? Tame the growing far-right nationalist movement across Canada. January 29, 1986, and Bristow was asked by a CSIS member if he could create a dossier on these South African diplomats while providing security. He obliged, and by March he was collecting information for them. In August, thanks to Bristow's investigation, one South African diplomat would be deported and 4 others would be barred from entering Canada. CSIS now considered him an asset, someone they can trust when called upon, and wasn't strictly on the payroll. It was the perfect scenario for Grant. He gets to play spy once in a while and still gets a steady paycheck from Koenen and Nagel. February of 1987, and CSIS called on him again. His next assignment: infiltrate the Canadian far right and collect evidence. Grant immediately got to work. When chatting with co-workers, he would slip racist remarks into conversations until he got the reputation he desired. In 1987, he would find an in through a friend of a friend named Max French. Since he allegedly knew nothing about modern nationalism, the CSIS handler would provide him with a quick overview and told him to read the Turner Diaries, an unhinged fever dream of a novel written by delusional white supremacist William Luther Pierce. He tried his best to use French as an intro into the movement, but it failed. His second attempt in 1988 met with much more success. He was put in contact with Don Andrews, the face of modern racism in Ontario. Born in Sarajevo in 1942, Don Andrews started life as
Willem Zlomislits.
His father was killed by Nazis and his mother was shipped to Germany post-occupation and used as slave labor. Willem was shoved in an orphanage and forgotten about. When the war ended, she was told he had died in a bombing raid, so she remarried a Canadian forceman named Frederick Andrews and moved to Toronto. Meanwhile, Willem was enjoying time in a communist youth group organized by Tito's Yugoslavia. While on vacation, he would break his leg and end up in a Red Cross hospital. This is how his mother would find him. In 1952, the family would be reunited in Toronto, and his name would be changed to Donald Andrews as he would fit in better with Canadian society. In the 60s, Don would form the Edmund Burke Society with some other college students. They were anti-communist, pro-Vietnam War, and not afraid to be open about their racist views. Don became a landlord in his adult life and used that money to bankroll a very comfortable lifestyle and rub elbows with the racist riffraff he attracted. The EBS would try to get into the Ontario provincial government by running for the Social Credit Party. Once found, they would be kicked out and the society dissolved in 1972. That did little to discourage Don, and he would start the Western Guard Party, very much an offshoot of the EBS, and this time not hiding behind communism or the Vietnam War. They were outright racist and anti-Semitic, and they weren't embarrassed to be known as such. In 1975, Don would be arrested for illegal weapons possession. The following investigation would uncover a plot to bomb the Israeli soccer team's dressing room. Don would get away without a conviction, but he couldn't be involved in the Western Guard Party anymore. That didn't mean he couldn't start a new party, and in 1977, Don would start the Nationalist Party of Canada. Don was Grant's ace in the hole. This was where the operation would really make headway, as long as he could get a position within the party. So he dedicated himself to the act. He was no longer Grant Bristow, failed comedian rent-a-cop who liked to drink and had a long-term girlfriend. He was Grant Bristow, the recovering alcoholic and passionate white supremacist. He lived alone, but no one was ever invited to his house, and he had no family. They all drowned in a tragic boating accident on Lake Winnipeg, while he was at the 1976 Montreal Olympics. In the last quarter of 1988, Grant was finally nose-to-nose with the cream of the neo-Nazi crop and started the newly dubbed Operation Governor. All CSIS wanted was facts, names, addresses, phone numbers, and intentions of the group he had become friendly with. They didn't care how he got the information, but they did caution him that he was getting a little too into character. A note on his file reads, "The source appears to be somewhat overzealous, which may compromise his confidentiality. Security precautions should be reinforced, and his progression in the field should be carefully monitored and directed." Undeterred by the CSIS worrywarts, Grant dove headfirst into the party. What he found didn't exactly impress him. The movement was only made up of at most 300 people. The majority lived under the poverty line and had very little in the way of education. Grant pivoted. If the current members weren't the real danger, he would follow the money and expose the real source of the movement. He buddied up with Don, and in April of 1989 would be connected with Wolfgang Droege. The former printer from Capital Business Forms had made a name for himself in the BC KKK when he and a few other clan members plotted to take over the Caribbean island of Dominica. Wolfgang would be in and out of prison for cocaine and weapons charges in the States for most of the 80s. Feeling out of place and alone, he returned to Canada under the helpful wing of the white nationalists that remained, since his BC KKK chapter had closed in his absence. That put him in direct line with Bristow, and the two of them would change the face of nationalism in Canada for the next decade. Grant was done with Don Andrews. After years of nosing around in his Nationalist Party as their security advisor, he had learned everything there was to learn, and it was a dead end. Drogi, on the other hand, was completely different. He was passionate, active, unafraid, and the people he surrounded himself with were just as excited. Grant immediately found his new rabbit to chase down the hole. With Drogi running promotions for the Nationalists, the new members of the party were no longer destitute hangers-on of Don Andrews' cult. These were college-educated middle-class young adults who all had bright futures ahead of them, if it wasn't for their obtuse views of a fair society. Grant would be an effective mirror to whatever Drogi said, keeping the echo chamber open to have things escalate, and escalate they did. Drogi began to have delusions of grandeur and envisioned himself in charge of the white power scene in Canada. He mulled around the idea of starting his own organization, toying with the names the Society for the Preservation of the White Race and the White Heritage Foundation. Grant had an eager ear and an agreeable voice. After all, this could be lucrative. All he had to do was get Drogi alone and push him to branch out. Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi hosted a party in August of 1989 for mutual haters of Zionism and American society. He invited leaders from the extreme left and the extreme right, meaning both Don and Wolfgang, plus 15 other nationalists, received an all-expenses-paid trip to Libya. Don would drop out due to legal troubles and told Wolfgang to choose an appropriate replacement. Naturally, he brought along Grant. The entire ordeal was far from smooth, but it did give Bristow a lot of time to get to know Drogi and hear out his grievances about the Nationalist Party. Drogi was done with Don Andrews. He was ineffective and lazy. Wolfgang wanted to do something new, something bold, something that would really put life into the collective far right. Grant played his role and egged him on. Drogi proposed that with their incomes combined, they could start a new movement called the Heritage Front and really shake up Canadian society. The trip turned out to be a perfect catalyst to get Grant where he wanted to be, as the trusted head of an organization that could catalog every white supremacist across Canada. He was so confident in the plan, when Drogi was arrested in Chicago on the way back from Libya, Grant pulled some strings at the Canadian embassy. Using the money the Libyans had given them, he got Wolfgang a lawyer, and eventually, he was deported back to Canada. However, things were not happy between Grant and CSIS. The Libyan trip was a hell of a task. The group nearly got detained in Rome and had to take a slow boat from Malta to Tripoli. The Chicago detention was the final straw. Grant explained that he needed Drogi to make this happen, and CSIS was forcing him to nearly blow his cover. This was the first time Bristow had an out. He could go home and union bust for Kuna and Nagel for the rest of his life. He would be Grant Bristow again, instead of whoever he was now. The Heritage Front would be officially formed on September 25th, 1989, by Wolfgang Drogi, Jerry Lincoln, James Dawson, and Grant Bristow. This gave Drogi a huge platform to stand on, and soon he was everywhere as the new face of Canadian hate. Grant would be the security chief and an advisor to him. According to Bristow, he often talked Wolfgang down from some of the more violent and useful schemes he came up with. He would try to redirect the group's thoughts, usually to money-making ventures like security detail or repossessing cars. Their friendship grew so close that when a few members came to Drogi with suspicions that Grant was an informant, he outright dismissed the claims without even looking into them. As the front grew more confident, violent plans would come to surface. CSIS reminded Grant that any illegal activities weren't sanctioned. If he so much vandalized a street sign, he would lose his position. In September of 1990, he was contacted by a Heritage Front member, Craig Zanotti, and his friend, Sean Maguire. They had a plan to spread a virus through the food crops in Canada to disrupt the food chain. After meeting with the two university students, Wolfgang hatched a plan to sell the idea to the Iraqi government through their contacts in Libya. Bristow once again echoed Drogi's passion and immediately reported it to CSIS. Thankfully, the plan was a total failure thanks to shoddy science. Grant had just dodged a potential huge fiasco, and he was getting concerned about how brazen and bold the ideas had become at the front. By the late 1990s, Grant was buddying up to Ernst Zundel, Canada's premier exporter of racist and anti-Semitic literature. Zundel was what Grant called a payday Nazi, spreading hate not to create a different society, but to get paid for their delusions. Regardless, Zundel had a huge voice around the world and would promote the Heritage Front regularly. Word got out west, and in 1991, Grant found himself hopping on a plane to talk to Terry Long and Al Hooper, two leaders of sister BC and Alberta area nationalist factions. Welcoming him with a warm reception, Bristow was provided with complete information of all their members under the guise of setting up a white supremacist computer network. He had successfully unearthed the roster of the entire Western Canadian hate movement in a matter of months. CSIS was obviously pleased with him. In early 1991, they allowed Grant to take some time off, and he booked a flight to London. Unfortunately for him, before he could get back to Canada, he would have to meet Zundel and Droege in Germany for a skinhead fan rally. Zundel would be arrested after starting a riot in Munich, so Droege hatched another plan. Take a trip to Dachau and educate the public. This is the origin of the photo at the start of the episode. That's Grant Bristow, the anti-racist pro-Semite about to get kicked out of Dachau because his business partner was going to start teaching class in perhaps the worst place to do it. They escaped Germany without any arrests, and in May of 1991 they would be providing security personnel for the Reform Party, all free of charge. Reform were a new federal conservative party that was rapidly growing in popularity across Canada. With their help, Heritage Front members like Alan Overfield would gain political influence within Toronto's Beaches Woodbine district, now Beaches East York. The party and the front grew very close, even allowing Bristow to provide personal security for its leader, Preston Manning, on multiple occasions. By September of that year, the Heritage Front would have their first public rally in Toronto, open up their hate hotline, and would even have their rallies televised on local news. The party flourished with new recruits. High schools, universities, and colleges would be bombarded with leaflets and posters asking young Canadians to join the front so they could save the white race. Among them was Elisa Hadigan, a 16-year-old Romanian runaway. The girl would be used as the face of the youth wing of the Heritage Front. All the rallies and the new members caught the attention of Richard Butler and his Idaho-based Aryan Nations, a nationwide American hate network. The front was invited to a gathering in 1991 and sent Bristow and Sean Maguire as emissaries. Grant recalls it being the largest gathering of dangerous white supremacists he had ever seen. Louis Beam, the man who inspired Timothy McVeigh to bomb Oklahoma City, was the guest of honor. Grant found more Western Canadian nationalists at the meetup, receiving advice and training that they could bring back to Canada. CSIS received a full report. In the second quarter of 1992, Droege would invite Tom Metzger to Toronto for a hate rally. Bristow would provide security as always. The rally was a huge success, enough to garner new attention from anti-fascist and anti-racist groups across North America. Metzger would be arrested and deported back to the US thanks to Grant's tips, but he now had a bigger issue at hand. He had lost his day job for being identified as a Heritage Front member, and Droege was calling for an all-out war with the left. Once the anti-Heritage Front groups entered the picture in numbers, Droege let slip the dogs of war. The hateful rhetoric was ramped up to ridiculous levels, calling for violence against the Front's enemies. Bristow says that he tried to quell the inevitable clash by redirecting efforts to a harassment campaign. He would start a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week hate hotline staffed by the Front's loyal members. They would gather phone numbers and addresses from anti-front activists and have people call them non-stop until they would give up information on similarly minded activists. This was called the IT campaign, and whoever was it would never stop receiving hate until they cracked. The front would use this to catalog information for future attacks and harassment campaigns. Grant mentions that this was the plan that he passed by his CSIS handlers to stop the violence from escalating, and they approved it. In fact, they didn't provide any alternative plan, so the hate campaign continued. Seeing rallies turned into bloodier and bloodier conflicts, Bristow would have to get a larger target to distract the restless front members. Posing as Trevor Graham, a reporter for the Ottawa Citizen, he would get business cards and interviews from the heads of target organizations, all in the hopes of appeasing the bloodlust. But there was only so long he could keep the violence at bay. May 29, 1993.
Heritage Front member George Birdie and his band Racial Holy War,
or RAHOWA for short, were playing a recruitment concert. On his order, roughly 60 Heritage Front members marched up to the Toronto War Memorial to engage with roughly 500 anti-front activists.
Alicia Rexon's nose was personally kicked in by Birdie.
Her face would be used to display the levels of violence now caused by the front. At the end of the battle, the front was outmatched and had to run. The victory that Drogi was searching for didn't materialize, and a few prominent front members caught assault charges. Just as he had tired of Don Andrews' leadership of the Nationalist Party, so the members of the Heritage Front were getting tired of Drogi's leadership. Splinter groups would form, most being unopposed to even worse violence than the Heritage Front ever committed to, and all of them were outside of Bristow's influence. After foiling a robbery from one of these splinter organizations, Grant would hit his apogee. Trying to get a semblance of a normal life, he married his longtime girlfriend in a secretive ceremony. He lied and said he was going on a business trip and would take a honeymoon to New York and try to forget about his double life. When he returned, he discovered that he was now the full leader of the Heritage Front. Drogi had been arrested for assaulting someone, leaving Grant as the de facto head of the front. This wasn't the same front he started years ago. This was the new front, with power-hungry young adults that were looking for blood, and didn't really care for Bristow's soft hand. They would dive into his backstory, how his family died, his relationship status, and his employment. One member would mention how fat he was getting, hinting at the possibility that he had a wife or a girlfriend on the side. The pressure was getting to Grant, and if Drogi was convicted and went to jail, he would be under 24-hour scrutiny from front members. This was the time. He had done all he could do. Now, all he had to do was leave and go back to regular life. In March of 1994, he would do just that. 1993 had taken a hard toll on the Heritage Front. The hotline was shut down thanks to the Canadian Jewish Congress, and the rallies had mostly stopped since the organizers had all been put in jail. The Trans-Canadian Nationalist Computer Network had still not materialized, and Drogi was starting to show the wear and tear of his constant on-the-go lifestyle. He was tired. Grant was tired. Everyone involved was just really tired. Elisa, the face of the youth portion of the front, had defected thanks to a leftist socialist organization. They were now spreading truth about the inner workings of the front and how ridiculous it was. Grant Bristow would officially leave the Heritage Front at the end of March 1994. He said he yearned for a regular life with his wife and stepson, and none of us here at Dive In really blame him. He broke the news to Drogi, who would openly shed tears, calling Bristow his closest and dearest friend. Grant would lie and reciprocate the statement. He told Wolfgang that he was taking a job east of Toronto and would return if possible. Likewise, he also closed out Operation Governor with CSIS. He says they offered him a salaried job with the department, but he turned them down. Grant Bristow could now return to being just Grant Bristow. In August of 1994, Bristow would get a call from Toronto Sun reporter Bill Dunphy on his unlisted number. Dunphy received a top-secret document that listed Grant as a CSIS plant within the far right. The information was leaked from a top-secret read and destroy memo. The memo was originally addressed to former Progressive Conservative Solicitor General Doug Lewis, and was regarding suspected white nationalists in the Canadian Airborne Regiment. The CIR is the same regiment who killed a Somali teen in cold blood. His assistant, Brian Francis McInnes, said he was disgusted how CSIS was handling the case. After losing his job, Brian decided to contact the media with the information he had. Brian's charges of espionage would be dropped and he would walk free. Returning to Dunphy and Bristow, Dunphy was adamant that the story had to break within 48 hours, despite Grant's protests. All he wanted from the meeting was Bristow's point of view and comments. He refused and rushed home to get his wife and stepson to safety. He called CSIS and they arranged a whole new life for him. Grant Bristow was now Nathan Black, married to Katrina Black, and they were from St. Albert, Alberta, a bedroom community north of Edmonton. While stuck in a Toronto hotel room, the story broke and Grant nearly died from anxiety. The article was a scathing portrayal of the operation, saying that Grant created a new powerful fascist wave sweeping across Canada, all bankrolled by tax dollars. Now he wouldn't be safe anywhere, with both the far right and the public gunning for his head.
After a quick stay in Jasper, they would be placed in a very well-appointed new home in St. Albert.
With 2 new cars and a reported $3,000 a month government allowance, Grant's position was almost enviable. He had the freedom to go to school for accounting and even attended his Jewish father-in-law's funeral in 1995. Bristow was seen wearing a yarmulke as one of the pallbearers, something he would have possibly been killed for a year ago. Little did he know, despite his best efforts at hiding, another Toronto reporter would find him. Using a picture of Bristow standing in front of a house and matching the stucco color, legendary investigative journalist Dale Bristow managed to find him and confront Grant while he was leaving the Sturgeon General Hospital. Bristow had broken his leg while skating, which meant that running away from Bristow was completely out of the question. As more information leaked, Grant's brother-in-law, Dan, came forward offering pictures and more information for a large cash payout. According to him, Grant was blabbing about his new arrangement at the funeral, so his exposure wasn't a surprise. As far as we can tell, no one took Dan up on his offer. CSIS shuffled them around again for protection, this time to Calgary in the interim. Grant would again watch from his hotel room as his new identity was broken down. The article included pictures of his wife, stepson, and even his home address. His new look of gaining 30 pounds, growing long hair, and shaving his beard was now broadcast to all of Canada. They would relocate to Edmonton for a few weeks until the hype died down, and would choose to return to St. Albert to face the controversy head-on. All three of them were done with running.
Thankfully, the public's interest in Grant died down quickly, partially due to the Oklahoma City bombing that happened around the same time.
The Canadian Security Intelligence Review Committee, or SIRC, would look into the whole debacle and come out with a surprisingly positive conclusion. In their eyes, Bristow did succeed in his mission, outing the majority of hate group members across Canada and actively trying to stop escalating violence with his phone scheme. His harassment campaign was deemed just legal enough to exonerate him of any wrongdoing. On the budget side of things, it's estimated that in 7 years on the CSIS payroll, Grant used roughly $260 a month for expenses. That's roughly $21,840 for various things like food and travel. Once he had lost his job, CSIS fronted him a similar salary, roughly $30,000 to $41,000 a year for 2 years. They estimate he got roughly $79,000. Again, the SIRC saw this as a win and called Bristow ethical in his spending. The far-right infiltration of the Reform Party was also investigated. They were either found willfully ignorant or didn't care about the Heritage Front's morals. On June 19, 1991, Droege would publicly throw his and the Front's support behind Reform leader Preston Manning. Alan Overfield would be the most involved member in the Reform Party infiltration and was the contact when they needed free security at a rally in Ontario. On February 27, 1992, Bill Dunphy would contact the Reform Party regarding the infiltration, and a day later everything was laid bare to the public. By March, the party had mostly purged itself of the Heritage Front. Speaking of Bill Dunphy, he would be let go from the Toronto Sun soon after outing Bristow in a large layoff. He, along with many others, still believed the SIRC picked and chose their information so that the operation seemed like a success. He also says Bristow was much more involved in the Front's growth and reinvented neo-Nazism in Canada. He currently works as a freelance typist as of 2023. Elisa Hadigan would become a passionate anti-racist public speaker and author. When she left the Front and spoke to the SIRC, she was not provided with the same protection package that they offered Grant. She took the same level of heat from her former comrades, but without any protection, and for that we believe she should be commended. For his attitude towards her and his witness protection package, she has an intense and constant loathing for Grant Bristow. There are mentions in the SIRC's findings where it's noted how ill-tempered he was with her, but perhaps that was by design. The paper mentions how Grant was antagonistic towards all of the young recruits of the Front. It seems to be a technique to force them out early. Elisa still claims that Grant was far more into the Heritage Front than he or CSIS let on.
In all her affidavits, she swears that Grant used far more than 21 grand and actively threatened people's lives. Add to that the constant recruitment for membership fees and pledge drives for donations, and she says that he made the Front far more profitable than it should have been. He connected some incredibly dangerous people together and gave them skills to find information for harassment purposes, and possibly for something worse. He was constantly protected by CSIS at every turn, yet her and other defectors see no support. Perhaps the worst aspect of it is that despite all the information, not one of the Heritage Front members was ever convicted of anything based on the information Grant provided. Sure, they went to jail on weapons and assault charges, but those were handed down by beat cops in the street. The investigation, she says, did nothing and possibly made things worse. Bill Dunphy and the CBC agreed. Despite calls for him to be charged and jailed, Grant would walk away from the accusations a free man. In a sworn affidavit, Wolfgang would echo a lot of what Elisa and Dunphy were saying, noting that the SIRC didn't interview the actual high-ranking members of the Heritage Front to get their side of the story. All of the blame was shifted from Bristow onto Drogi and the other top members. In his opinion, the SIRC was trying to save its own skin and try to make the operation look like a success, despite the front's growth in power and relevance.
The Heritage Front itself would rapidly decline after Drogi went to prison and eventually retired. The leadership reins would be handed over to Mark Lemire in 1995, and then fizzle out by 2008. The last scandal concerning the front happened in 2019, when Mark was found to be working at the city of Hamilton. The city and Mark found a settlement, and Mark would find much less public-facing employment.
In 2000, Grant and his wife would divorce. It was mutual.
In 2004, he would do a tell-all interview with the Canadian magazine The Walrus. He was thinking of writing a book, but so far it hasn't materialized. Grant would return to the Beaches district of Toronto, dodging Wolfgang Drogi until 2005, when Drogi was gunned down by a drug addict he was selling to. Bristow would remarry, become a grandfather, produce some movies, and is currently working as a marketing consultant somewhere in Western Canada. In 2009, he would get throat cancer, but it's thankfully in remission as of 2017. He still keeps in touch with his friends over at the Canadian Jewish Congress, and is seen today as somewhat of a folk hero in the Ontario Jewish community. He looks at the MAGA rallies in the States with a similar lens to the Heritage Front.
CSIS is still Canada's intelligence agency, despite their many scandals. There were very valid questions about the operation. Why did they let Tom Metzger into the country only to arrest and deport him after he riled up the Heritage Front's base? What were they going to do with all the leftist information that Grant gathered with his telephone scheme? Why would you connect all these very dangerous people and then let Grant teach them these useful skills? Grant's handler, Al Tredenick, would continue to work there despite the public backlash to his laissez-faire attitude with Operation Governor. In 2011, he would work for BlackBerry as a security liaison and now runs a public safety consulting firm. CSIS did try to infiltrate the left organizations opposed to the front, around the same time that Bristow was operating, but it seems they had less initial success. Not to be based or anything, but if this video has left any impression on you, please let it be that the government really doesn't have your best interests at heart, regardless of what you believe.
So what do you think? Was Grant a hero or just an enabler? And is this peaceful new persona just another chameleon act? Thanks for watching.